A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and if you're returning to the podcast, welcome back. It's great to see you once again. And to those of you who have found us for the first time, welcome on board. I hope that you find the details of the podcasts that we do to be both engaging and, perhaps more importantly for some of you, educational in their application and content. So, some of you may be aware that today, and we are on the 12th of February 2026, the MAIB have published their report on a collision which happened in the German Bight, traffic separation scheme of the German Bight to be exact, between two vessels, a fairly small vessel called the Verity, a coaster, and a somewhat larger vessel called the Polesie. Now, the Polesie was registered in the Bahamas. The Verity was registered in the Isle of Man. Polesie, 190 metres long. Verity, only 91 metres long. The gross tonnage of the Polesie, 24,055. Gross tonnage of the Verity, 2,601. So the Verity was a significantly smaller general cargo vessel. The MAIB have produced the report. Now, this is not unusual. Verity was registered in the Isle of Man, Polesie in the Bahamas, but the Isle of Man, being part of the Red Ensign Group, may elect in the fulfilling of their obligations to the IMO to investigate accidents, may delegate that investigation to the United Kingdom's body, the Marine Accident Investigation Branch. And that's exactly what has happened in this case. So we've got an MAIB report, but the MAIB report is written on behalf of the Isle of Man Ship Registry, as I say, to uphold their obligation to investigate and report incidents. It's a sad collision. The reason it's a sad collision, as I would explain later on, is that the Verity sank very, very quickly. 7 crew on board, 2 of them survived. Only one body was found. 2 survivors and a body found. The body was that of the master of the Verity. So the whereabouts at the time of writing the report of the other 4 crew members of the Verity are currently unknown. So a very sad collision that has resulted in loss of life. Easy for us all to say that this was avoidable because ultimately we have the benefit of hindsight. But now, having read through the report, there are several things about the report itself and about some of the assumptions that are made in the report regarding action to be taken under the rule of the road, which I think are open to discussion and perhaps debate moving forwards. The MAIB are, of course, very, very careful when they write their reports, and sometimes the devil is in the detail. It's quite easy when you look at one of these reports to go very, very quickly to the body of the report itself. So that's to sort of jump to the synopsis, if you like, and start to read about actually what happened and get to the crux of the incident and, get deep into the nitty-gritty of the report. However, in this MAIB report, the MAIB have been at pains to explain some of the difficulties that they came across whilst trying to investigate this particular accident. The MAIB explain what their role was, in that they were appointed by the flag state of the ship, namely the Isle of Man, to do the investigation on behalf of the Isle of Man and the Bahamas Maritime Authority. The German Federal Bureau of Maritime Casualty Investigation contributed towards the report, but left the report to be written by the MAIB as the lead investigative body. Now, it goes on to say, and this is still in the background, so this is way before we get into any of the nitty-gritty details about the collision. It goes on to say that the investigators had real trouble collecting evidence from the German side of the investigation. Now, the German side of the investigation mainly consists of the intervention from VTS. And under German law, witnesses are entitled to refuse to answer questions if those answers might incriminate them. Now, in the United Kingdom, we are at pains to say that marine accident investigation isn't there to determine liability or blame. It is simply there to determine how the incident could be avoided from a safety point of view. And that anything that you say to an investigator cannot be used against you in a court of law, because mainly in the United Kingdom you haven't been read your rights, and therefore anything that you say can't be used against you. So as far as incriminating yourself, it's impossible to do that in front of the MAIB. German law is completely different, and they allow their witnesses, even in front of their safety investigators, to remain quiet if they think their answers may incriminate them. And reading through this report here, it would appear that the MAIB have come up against this when trying to determine what was said by the VTS. This is German by VTS. Don't forget, this is a VTS, a vessel traffic service. In other words, it is a traffic service that is able to give directions to ships. And that's worth bearing in mind as we kind of progress through discussing this collision. So what happened? Well, I'm going to try and describe to you the geographical nature of this collision. I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. If you imagine the small ship Verity was heading in roughly a northerly direction. It wasn't exactly north, but roughly a northerly direction. The Polesie was on her starboard bow and heading in roughly a westerly direction. Now, it's important to note that the large cruise ship Iona was just over a mile on the Polesie's port quarter. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, because that isn't mentioned enough in the report, in my opinion. So Verity has the Polesie on her starboard bow. It's a crossing situation. Rule 15 applies. Verity is the giveaway vessel. Polesie is the stand-on vessel, and Polesie was required, of course, to maintain her course and speed. Those of you that are unfamiliar with that German Bight TSS, which, by the way, included me before I read this report, is that the TSS is a very, very complicated one. It has north and southbound lanes, which cross east and westbound lanes. So if you like, you've kind of got a T-junction of traffic separation schemes just inside the, or I should say just outside of the 12-mile limit that off the German coastline. Now, this obviously complicates the situation somewhat, because Rule 10 applies to the traffic going north and south, and it applies to the traffic going east and west, and the two lanes do intersect one another pretty much at 90 degrees. So, fundamentally, the Verity is proceeding north in the traffic separation scheme. The Polesie is proceeding west in the traffic separation scheme. Verity has Polesie on her own starboard side, and therefore is the giveaway vessel. Now, the report has a radar picture, which fundamentally shows that Verity was showing on Polesie's radar. Now, all the way through this, we're going to talk about the evidence coming from Polesie. And the main reason for that is that Verity was so small that she did not require a Voyage Event Recorder. And therefore, no data was available from the Verity on how the Officer Watch had the radar set up, what was showing on the radar, etc., etc. But they use Polesie's radar as evidence. That's not because they are necessarily pointing the finger at Polesie by using all of her evidence. It's because Polesie was the only one with a Voyage Event Recorder on, or the only ship involved in the collision, shall we say, with a Voyage Event Recorder on it. And that's something the report highlights at the end, in that recommendations are that Voyage Event Recorders are put on ships over 500 gross tons and not ships over 3,000 gross tons, as is currently the law. If that were the case, then Verity would have had a VER as well. It might have been easier to look at what was going through the mind of the Officer of the Watch, who sadly died on Verity, as that Officer of the Watch approached the Polesie, so as to involve risk of collision, and pretty much failed to take any action. So, crossing situation, the two vessels are basically coming together as I've described. Now, we don't really know what was happening on Verity's bridge because of the lack of VER, but Verity fundamentally continued on her northerly track, and the risk of collision with Polesie was evident. Was evident quite far out, 45 minutes out. The CPA, as determined, was determined as being much less than we would like it to be, even in these heavy traffic conditions. And therefore, why Verity maintained her course and speed, we're unsure about. As the vessels got close to one another, there was an intervention by the German Bight VTS. Now, the German Bight VTS intervened when the distance between the vessels was less than 1.3 nautical miles. In other words, this is very, very late intervention from VTS. Yeah, 8 minutes out of the collision, VTS intervene, and basically they call up the Verity, and they say that they've got a very small CPA with the vessel on your starboard side. The Polesie, what's your intention? Verity comes back and says, my intention is to keep my course and speed. It's possible, change course to port, then we'll pass on my stern. Now, that's a very, very broken transmission, but I read the same as I think the VTS operator would read, and that is that Verity's asking to maintain course and speed, and asking if the vessel crossing on his starboard bow, crossing starboard to port, can alter course to port and pass astern. So the VTS come back and say, according to the rules, you have to act to avoid a collision, and you talked to the vessel Polesie? The Verity comes back and says, okay, I will change my course to starboard and will pass on aft. Again, very broken English, but like VTS, I would have said that was them saying that they're going to alter course to starboard and pass at the aft end of the crossing Polesie. VTS said that they will inform the vessel Polesie that you will pass astern of them, and Verity comes back, okay, I will pass astern of motor vessel Polesie. VTS are then forced to call the Polesie up and tell the Polesie what the passing situation is. Now, this would seem strange to a Southampton pilot because Channel 12 is a simplex channel, and when VTS are talking to a ship on Channel 12 in Southampton, fundamentally what that means is everybody can hear both sides of the conversation. Amazingly, the German Bight VTS use a duplex channel. They use channel 80. Just to explain what a duplex channel is. A duplex channel, the shore station transmits on one frequency and the ship station transmits on another frequency. Yep, the shore station receives on the same frequency that the ship transmits on, and vice versa. Now, the trouble with this is that it's only a one-way conversation you can ever hear. So on board the bridge of Polesie, whilst the VTS were clarifying with Verity what her intentions were, Polesie would not have been able to hear the Verity's response. That's why, having ascertained from the Verity that she will pass astern of motor vessel Polesie, the VTS then had to go to Polesie and speak to her. Again, there is a rather broken, in my opinion, conversation. They called up Polesie, Polesie replies, and VTS say, yes, sir, there's a small CPA with the motor vessel Verity on your port side, so the motor vessel Verity will pass behind you. He told me he will come to starboard and pass behind you. Please be aware of the situation. And the response back from the Polesie says, yes, I will be looking and be a little to starboard. That's a very ambiguous statement to make. I will be a little to starboard. Now, Verity then starts altering course to starboard very, very slowly. But amazingly, at the same time, the Polesie starts altering course to port. So the Polesie statement, I will be looking and be a little to starboard, was very, very ambiguous and effectively wrong, because at that point the Polesie starts altering course to port. Now they see this on the VTS radar, and VTS then try to intervene. Okay, now Polesie is altering course to port, which is against the collision regulations. Yeah, it's unseamanlike thing to do, but nonetheless, he starts altering course to port. I suspect this is because the Verity left it so late to make an alteration of course to starboard that with the vessels approaching one another, it may be that the officer of the watch on the Polesie thought that he was acting under Rule 17b. In other words, he was taking action that would best aid to avoid collision with the Verity. So fundamentally, we've gone beyond the May stage of taking action as the stand-on vessel. The Polesie now considers himself taking the action that best aids to avoid collision and starts turning to port. The Verity starts a slow turn to starboard, and VTS see this. So VTS once again intervene and tell the Polesie to go hard to starboard. So VTS call to Polesie, come to starboard, and 6 seconds later, again, come to starboard. Yeah, Polesie's rudder then goes hard to starboard, but it takes a good 25 seconds for Polesie's rate of turn to port to stop before she starts coming back round to starboard. The investigators ascertained that had Polesie continued to alter her course to port, she may indeed have missed Verity, although bear in mind that Verity at this stage was making a slow alteration of course to starboard to pass astern of the Polesie. The result of this ultimate confusion is that there is a collision, and the larger vessel Polesie strikes Verity on her starboard side, about 11 metres forward of her accommodation, and puts a hole. The bulbous bow comes through the wing tank and into the single hold. So Verity's very, very small. She's only got one hold into the single hold, and Verity rolls down the starboard side of Polesie, scraping down past her anchor, which we think did damage to the starboard bridge ring, as she did. Then Verity, very, very sadly, fills up with water extremely quickly. Now, Verity was carrying steel coils. Steel coils are, of course, an incredibly dense cargo. And there's not many steel coils in the hold before the vessel is fully laden. That means that there's a very high permeability to the hold. In other words, there's a lot of water that can enter that hold, along with the weight of the steel coils. The hole in the side of the ship is huge. There are pictures on the report, so you can imagine the water rushing into the single hold. The vessel very, very quickly took a severe starboard list and started to go down rapidly by the head, mainly because the damaged area is forward of the accommodation and the engine room. Engine room still intact with regards to buoyancy. So all that water rushing in is going to flood the forward part of the vessel. So Verity starts to list to starboard rapidly and go down by the head. This causes the steel coils to start to shift. So their lashings break. The steel coils all shift to starboard and all start running forward, which can be seen by an underwater picture that was taken of the wreck afterwards. And that's going to cause the ship to lose stability rapidly. That, combined with the free surface effect of the water rushing into the hold, is going to cause the ship not just to lose stability, but to sink rapidly. This was indeed the case. There was a second officer and the AB were on the port side of the ship, and as the ship listed heavily to starboard and sank, they were able to jump clear of the ship. They weren't wearing any life jackets. They were in everyday clothing. And they entered the water. They were the two survivors. They were both eventually recovered. One of them by the Polesie, actually. The other one by a search and rescue helicopter, I believe. They both survived. The body of the master was found sometime later by another vessel and taken ashore. But, as I said at the beginning, the other four bodies were not found. Now, to me, this is an incredibly sad collision. One that could have been avoided, and as I said at the beginning, it's all right with hindsight to say it could have been avoided, but if just the basics of the collision regulations were followed, and Verity took early action to keep clear of Polesie, then this collision may not have happened. But I think that Verity was perhaps a bit reluctant to alter course to starboard, which in a crossing situation would normally be the most appropriate alteration of course to make in order to pass astern of the stand-on vessel in a crossing situation. Rule 15 says to avoid passing ahead, but Rule 15 does not say you can't alter course to port. So Verity did have options. She could have reduced speed and allowed Polesie to pass ahead of her. She could have altered course to port and paralleled Polesie's course and allowed Polesie to pass down her starboard side. So she had options. But the option that perhaps she was forced into considering was the option to alter course to starboard. Now, when I say forced into considering, she wasn't forced into doing it, but the VTS are starting to insinuate that that was the most appropriate action. But was it? You heard me say earlier on that Verity took action very, very late. I think Verity's action was taken late because she was waiting until she had crossed the bow of the Iona. I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that Iona was on Polesie's port quarter at just over a mile away. Now, if she'd have come to starboard earlier, she might have passed too close ahead of the Iona. If she'd have come right round to starboard in order to try and get astern of Iona as well as Polesie, she actually would have been contravening the traffic separation scheme lane. Yeah, because she'd have literally had to have come 90 degrees to starboard, and then she would be going against the general direction of traffic flow. So Iona's not mentioned as often as I think it should be. Iona did nothing wrong. She was following the same traffic lane as the Polesie, but her presence there, I think, is what generated the doubt in the Verity's Officer of the Watch's mind as to what the best course of action would be to avoid collision with the Polesie. Whether or not the Verity's Officer of the Watch did indeed track Polesie, we'll never know. We'll never know whether the Officer of the Watch on the Verity was aware of the risk of collision with the Polesie. We're not too sure about that, but as things developed, visibly, it would have been a problem. The Iona is a big ship. She's a big cruise ship. She'd have been well lit. She's quite imposing when she comes down on you, because not only her size, but the amount of lights that she carries makes her a very, very obvious high-risk target. And to an officer of the watch on a very, very small ship, she would have looked even bigger and even more imposing. So to turn to starboard towards her to try and get round her stern as well may have been something that the officer of the watch on the Verity did not want to do. At the end of the day, Rule 8C says if there's sufficient sea room, an alteration of course alone may be the most effective way to avoid collision, provided it's substantial, made in ample time, and does not result in another close quarter situation. Perhaps Verity's officer of the watch considered an alteration of course to starboard would result in another close quarter situation with the Iona. And that's why Verity left it too late to start to come to starboard, because they wanted to get across Iona's bow so that they could then come to starboard for the Polesie and therefore not, if you like, embarrass the cruise ship on Polesie's port quarter. But I really don't understand what the officer of the watch, I think it was the chief mate, on the Polesie was thinking as Polesie altered course to port. The officer of the watch on Polesie even told the VTS that they would be a little to starboard. Yep. Now, interpret that how you like. It's an incredibly ambiguous statement to make to VTS. But be a little to starboard to me says that they would stay to perhaps the starboard side of that traffic separation scheme. So like the VTS operator, I must admit, reading that, I would have made exactly the same assumption, and that would be that Polesie would maybe alter course to starboard to try and give a little bit more sea room for Verity to come round. But instead of doing this, her officer of the watch systematically altered course to port. In fact, even worse, the officer of the watch made several small alterations of course to port, followed by one larger alteration of course to port. So initially, it wouldn't have been obvious to Verity's officer of the watch that Polesie's chief mate was altering course to port instead of coming to starboard or even maintaining course and speed. The intervention at the last minute by VTS is not the first time that a VTS intervention has resulted in a collision, albeit inadvertently resulted in a collision. Some of you may remember the case of the Polesie, a small general cargo vessel that had a collision, again with a much bigger bulk carrier, in the Dover Straits. The Polesie altered course to starboard without checking her starboard quarter when a round turn to starboard was suggested by a VTS operator at Dover. The young officer of the watch on the Polesie, having had that just mentioned to them, took it on board and immediately executed it, thinking to themselves, well, if VTS have said it, it must be a good thing to do. He flung the helm to starboard, came around, didn't check his starboard quarter where the bulk carrier was, and gave it a thump. So inadvertently in that case, VTS intervention caused the Polesie to alter course. In this respect here, I think that the VTS intervention contributed twice to this collision. I think their late intervention, when the two vessels were 1.3 miles away, confused the situation. Confused the situation for two reasons. One, the statements back from both ships were ambiguous. And ambiguity at this late stage in the developing collision is not what you want. And two, the fact that it was done over a duplex channel, as explained earlier on, means that one ship cannot hear the other talk. So there is a disconnect between the ships. But why are we talking about VHF here? Yep. The MCA clearly state in MGN 324 that using a VHF for collision avoidance can have dire consequences, and that ships should stick to complying with the collision regulations. The VHF side of things has been introduced by VTS. Neither Polesie nor Verity attempted to contact one another on the VHF to avoid a pass. The VHF discussions were started by VTS, and I don't think that's something that the report focuses in enough on. Yeah, there are times, as the report points out, where VHF may be appropriate, particularly when the two vessels are far enough apart without a risk of collision to perhaps discuss a developing situation. But once risk of collision has started to exist, then the VHF becomes dangerous. The rules do not discuss VHF, so Rule 15 does not mention VHF. None of the COLREGs mention VHF, so no provision is given within the collision regulations for use of VHF. Now, some textbooks do say that the use of VHF will become more commonplace as the identification of other vessels becomes much more efficient due to introductions of things like AIS, where a positive identification of a vessel will allow you to contact that vessel by VHF. But even still, this collision happened recently when AIS had been in for a long time. The AIS targets were clear for all to see. Yet, the intervention and the introduction of VHF by the VTS seems to have cast doubt on what might have been a very, very close near miss, but a near miss that would have happened because of a late alteration of a small vessel who was afraid to come to starboard because of the presence of a very large cruise ship. Yes, it wouldn't have been particularly tidy. Yes, it would have been close, but I think it may have been resolved by Verity's Officer of the Watch once they crossed the bow of Iona, albeit late action. It would have been in compliance with the basics to give way, but not in compliance with Rule 8. In other words, it wouldn't have been early enough action, but nonetheless, it might have avoided a collision. I can't seem to get my head past this introduction of the VHF ambiguity that was brought about when the VTS supervisor started to intervene. Yeah, by instructing Polesie to come to starboard in the latter stages when they were only 2 minutes out of collision, by saying come to starboard, that VTS supervisor effectively may have caused the collision, because that's what the chief officer on Polesie did. He altered course to starboard. He put the helm hard a starboard. But Polesie was swinging to port. Polesie was swinging to port and may have cleared Verity before that intervention from VTS. Remember what I said at the beginning of the podcast? To be a VTS, you must have the power of direction. Yeah, and that power of direction may come from a port authority, it may come from the flag state. But nonetheless, you can't be called a VTS now by the IMO unless you have the powers to direct. The Officer Watch on the Polesie may have been aware of the German powers to direct within that VTS, and therefore, when VTS are saying come to starboard, he's worried that if he ignores VTS, then he might get into trouble for ignoring them. When really, although his alteration of course to port was wrong, unjustified, not in compliance with the COLREGs, and very, very unseamanlike, in this case, he may have been able to avoid Verity by continuing the swing to port. VTS saying hard a starboard may have been what ultimately caused the collision. It may have been what ultimately caused the Polesie to penetrate the tank and hull of the Verity, causing her to sink so quickly. Had the Polesie have continued her turn to port, she may have given the Verity a glancing blow, and Verity may have got away with minor damage. But by coming to starboard, the bulbous bow entered the wing tank and entered the hold, causing that massive ingress of water. Now, the timing of the actions taken by both Polesie and Verity leaves a lot to be desired. Both of them left it way too late before they started to take any kind of action. And so, amazingly, the report focuses on this. Now, I find the putting of numbers against when action should be taken to be a really, really dangerous thing to do. But nonetheless, the report has chosen to do this. It's chosen to do this by referencing to a publication. That publication, some of you may be familiar with. It's Cockcroft's A Guide to the Collision Avoidance Rules, the 7th edition. Now, an MCA surveyor once said to me, Cockcroft is an opinion, I am the law. And I think that is partly true, because Cockcroft's opinion is based upon case law. The trouble with case law is that when these things are thrashed out in court, they're not being thrashed out in court because they are pertinent to safety. They are normally being thrashed out in court in order to apportion blame and liability. And so, therefore, by going by case law, you may skew what the seaman would do under the ordinary practice of good seamanship as required by the rules. But nonetheless, using case law and using Cockcroft's book, the MAIB have chosen to put in some numbers with regards to, in particular, being the stand-on vessel. So they have come to the conclusion that as a giveaway vessel, you should have taken action 12 minutes before the TCPA. Okay, collision minus 12. Yeah, they say that action by the giveaway vessel is required. As for the stand-on vessel, then they're saying that somewhere between collision minus 9 and collision minus 5 minutes, the stand-on vessel may have taken action under Rule 17A2 by her manoeuvre alone, and therefore avoided altering course to port for a vessel on her own port side by complying with Rule 17C as well. They then go further to say that once you are inside collision minus 5, so under 5 minutes before collision, that's when Rule 17B kicks in. That's when the action by the action to avoid collision cannot be made by the giveaway vessel alone. So Rule 17B says where the two vessels find themselves so close that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the giveaway vessel alone, the stand-on vessel shall take such action as will best aid to avoid collision. It says that kicks in at collision minus 5. These are all based on case law and the interpretation of that case law by the Guide to Collision Avoidance Rules. But I find it incredible that the MAIB have decided to publish those times. Now, they say it's a guide, and they're at pains to say that that's not a definitive thing, but nonetheless, it's there, and it's out there. I think it's out there. I think it will be asked about in MCA exams. I think those numbers are going to be banded about for a long time to come, having featured in an MAIB investigation. I personally think that the publication of those times is dangerous. If you are the officer of the watch on the ship and you feel obliged to take action to avoid collision before collision minus 12, then take that action to avoid collision. Yeah. If you feel that the other vessel is not taking action as required by the rules, you may take action before C minus 9. Yeah. So much depends upon the sea room, the size of the vessels, the turning circle of the ships, the visibility. So much varies these times that the actual publication, particularly of that C-5, that action required under 17B by the stand-on vessel to take action, when she must take action at C-5, I find to be incredibly dangerous. But it's out there now, and I would recommend that everybody has a look at this report. In particular, those of you going up for a COC soon. It was published today, Polesie versus the Verity. It's an MAIB report. You can find it online easily. Read it, get to grips with the situation, and know what went on, because I'm convinced that numbers and principles from this report are going to start to make their way into various parts of UK COC exams. But if they don't, as far as I'm concerned, that's great. I would never, ever consider being that prescriptive in a report when it comes to when somebody reading that report, particularly a junior officer reading that report, when they should be taking action. I hope you found this podcast interesting. It will open debate, I'm sure, as to whether or not the publication of those timings and whether or not some of my assumptions on how culpable I feel that VTS was for their intervention actually is. But nonetheless, it's a good debate to have, and hopefully those of you reading the report will get a lot from it. Remember that at the end of the day, an MAIB report is there for reasons of safety, not to apportion blame or liability. And so that must be in the back of your mind at all times when reading this report. Thanks a lot, guys, for listening to the podcast. I look forward to welcoming you all back soon. But in the meantime, have a great day, everyone.